The Unthinkable. It was Monday, April 2nd, my birthday, a day to remember. I took the day off work to bring Brian back to the ward. Dr. Murphy was leading Brian's care team in the absence of Dr. Cotter, who was attending the Lindsay Tribunal, an investigation into blood products in Ireland. He said he'd like a word. No response, he said. I took a risk last week with very strong chemo because there was no response the previous week. There's no response again. He's a young man. We'll do everything we can, but it doesn't look good. Oh God! My mind was racing. Was he telling me that? John's words came back to me. If they don't cure it, he won't be with us this time next year. What do you mean by, it doesn't look good? I asked. Typically, Dr. Murphy answered, before chemo, a patient with Brian's type of leukemia could expect to live 3 to 4 weeks from date of diagnosis. We've been treating him for 2 weeks, and because he has no response, we're talking about a week, maybe 2 at most. Brian is critically ill. My world just stopped turning. There was no cover-up, no room for misunderstanding in Dr. Murphy's words. My world seemed to stand right there, suspended in disbelief. Some kind of slow-motion replay was going on in my head. What had he just said? Critical? A week? No response? What in God's name am I going to do? I thought. Dear God, what is Brian going to do? How are we going to survive this? Brian isn't going to survive this? Having a very sick child is one thing. Having a child about to die is a totally different space to be in. Disbelief, shock, terror. I can't tell you how I felt. I was trying to think rather than feel. Somehow, thinking of things I should do was a way of keeping my mind off the chilling fact that Brian was critically ill. I needed to put some boundaries on my situation, to contain it in a way that I could somehow cope with. I remember my most consoling thought at that time came from my common sense. Other people have survived this, I reminded myself. This happens to lots of families, and somehow they make it through. I went back to Brian with a smile on my face. Everything's okay, love. I'll be back in a while. I kept it light and carefree, I hoped. Outside the hospital, I phoned John and told him what I had just heard. My husband, ever the optimist, tried to console me, and without doubt himself. His voice was thick with desperation. But they're trying everything. He's getting more chemo. Please God, it will work. His immediate reaction was to ring the doctor himself. Surely I had got it wrong. Surely there was another version of the story. I went across to my regional office nearby and applied for compassionate leave of absence from work. I would be paid for 2 to 3 weeks. It looked like this was all the time I was going to need. Is there anything you want? Anything I can do? Said Ray, my boss, when I phoned to tell him my news. He reassured me that he would manage without me. I called into my work to tie up some loose ends of paperwork and tell everyone I was on leave. John and I had a moment to talk together outside the hospital. Mostly we were operating in shifts, in staying with Brian, so that he was never alone. So we had little time to discuss things together. Look at all those bastards out there and nothing wrong with them. And our poor Brian who wouldn't hurt a fly, and look what he's going through, said John, his words spoken straight from the heart. On my way home from the hospital that night, I remember calling to my friend and neighbour Catherine to thank her for going to Delphi a few years ago with myself and Brian. It was the annual 4th-year trip to Delphi Activity Centre, and being athletic, Brian was really looking forward to it. However, that morning, before they departed, Brian was put off the bus due to a dispute about seats. Despite his repentance and apologies, he spent the day picking up papers in the school as punishment. When I met Catherine that evening for our usual walk, I told her how annoyed I was, as I felt the punishment didn't match the crime. Ever the problem solver, she suggested that I just bring him there myself. A few phone calls later, I had permission from the principal to bring Brian to join his class. I was working the next morning, so we decided to jump in the car there and then on that cold winter's night. She was such a good friend. Neither of us knew the exact route to this fairly remote location. At midnight, on some narrow road with only sheep for company, we were utterly lost. This was in the days before sat-nav. "Look," Catherine said, efficient as ever. "There are lights behind us on the road. If you stop, the person behind us will have to stop too. And we'll ask directions." So we stopped. Catherine hopped out and flagged down the man in a jeep. She explained that we needed directions. He took a mass card from the glove compartment and drew a map of the final 5 minutes of our journey, and off we set. Soon Catherine noticed that the lights had gone. Disappeared. There was no place to go on this narrow road. No left, no right. What the heck? Where had this man and his jeep disappeared to? We looked down at our mass card with the map to Delphi Activity Centre. Now, I believe in angels and all that, but Catherine is such a sensible woman, not taken to flights of fancy. When she suggested it was an angel, I knew it wasn't a figment of my imagination. We dropped off the penitent Brian after a trip of more than 5 hours, and the non-stop round trip saw us back in time for me to go to work. The plant I gave to Catherine to thank her for her support is still called her angel plant. So I visited her that evening, that awful evening after the hospital. I wanted to thank her for helping me to show Brian that he was loved, whether he was in the right or in the wrong. He too met the angel that helped us all that night. I know it's odd that going to Delphi should cross my mind at such an emotional time, but I was grateful that Brian had got to have that outing with his class, and that he had enjoyed it so much. Catherine was instrumental in making this happen. Our other children had to be told that their brother was not going to survive this illness. Our eldest John was busy working towards his final exams in business studies, and also had a part-time job to fund his college expenses. Naturally, he knew about Brian's illness, but we had painted a hopeful picture, because we were hopeful. Now I needed to phone him and explain that the news was much worse than any of us had imagined. What can I do? His first reaction on hearing the terminal diagnosis had been to rush home and be with Brian. I thought it a good idea for us to carry on as normal so we wouldn't alarm Brian. So I told him to stay on at college for the moment, and to come home only at weekends. Paul, our middle son, was already keenly aware of how serious the situation was, as Melissa had sadly died of that same illness. Vicky had to know. It was such an unbelievable story to try to tell. She was in and out to Brian every day in the hospital, so she would know everything as it happened. I knew they wouldn't really take in the enormity of the words I said. I hadn't truly taken it on board myself. How could I say out loud what I did not even believe deep down? I could not visualize Brian's dead body. I could not contemplate that our time with Brian was going to be very short. I did the best I could to say to the children that Brian was not going to make it through this. Those words seemed to take the edge off the reality, and were all I could come up with. I doubt it was very convincing. It was all such a whirlwind. A few short weeks ago, Brian was a tall young man talking about his future, styling his hair this way and that as teenagers do, with an eye on the girls. When he had been admitted to hospital, he was listed as anorexic because he couldn't eat with the pain, and consequently had lost a lot of weight. He was 6 feet tall and 7 stone 9 pounds, only 48.5 kilos. Pain was still a big issue for Brian, and his knees and ankles were red and swollen. I stayed in his hospital room late into the night and came back early in the morning, but I didn't want to frighten him by staying through the night. It was just so difficult to know how to make the best decisions. All I can tell you is that I tried to weigh things up and do the best I could not to alarm Brian. He had not guessed he was going to die. It was the farthest thing from his mind, I would say. He was concerned about doing his exams, as he didn't want to be left behind when his friends went on to college. I didn't wish to worry him by staying overnight, so I stayed in the corridor during the night, but not in his room. I could be with him in moments. I went out the door every night saying to him that hopefully he would be feeling a bit better tomorrow. Life was completely different, and I had no experience to fall back on that would help me through. An 18-year-old boy does not want his mum fussing. But neither does he want to be alone, in pain, needing a drink of water. With Brian being critically ill, I knew that any setback could mean I might need to be with him straight away. So staying in the corridor seemed like a reasonable solution. So I stayed outside his door all night. In isolation, he painted such a lonely, solitary picture. Being confined to a room is, in itself, a cruel punishment. And I didn't know what Brian had done to deserve this. There was no question of coming home for the weekend. The Thursday night of the following week was a nightmare. I never left Brian's side that night. He was in unbelievable pain. "Rub me, mummy, rub my legs, rub my back," he pleaded. It was this terrible bone pain. It's like, when you go out in the snow and your hands are freezing. When you come in home and warm them on the heater, they really pain. That's what the pain is like, Mum. I can't handle it. "We'll handle it together, love," I answered, with a great deal more confidence than I felt. I knew my massaging did nothing, but I wished it did. With all my heart, I asked God to forget my limitations and just let His love and healing flow down my hands and into my Brian's thin and pain-ridden body to ease his pain. But the pain was relentless. Massaging him passed the time on that terrible night. But I didn't want time to pass. I wanted it to stop. Marion was the nurse on duty. She was on relief duty from another ward. A new person in our world. She was like an angel. She gave him morphine all night. She was so kind. But there was no letting up. If he was to die, why did he have to suffer as well? "Brian, let go of the pain. Let go. Let go," I kept saying. I didn't want him hanging on to life if this was to be his life. I did my best to sound confident and cheerful. Then the intravenous line failed. It was a small problem, really. But in his condition, it was sometimes difficult to get a vein, and there was more pain in putting in a new line when he was already so strung out. Marion was so patient and gave him so much time. She said she would contact the nearby Marymount Hospice in the morning. They could provide better pain relief than the ward. This was Holy Thursday night. Every moment was lived. Every moment was suffered. We experienced our own Gethsemane. It takes a lot of pain for a mother to wish her child were dead. What to do? What to do? So much has been written about in this world, but I didn't have a manual to guide me down this path. This was the first time I stayed all night with Brian. The next day he began to wear patches prescribed by the hospice, and the pain became more manageable. Brian had tablets and patches in lieu of injections. With his propensity for bleeding, this was a safer route. I made sure that he was never left alone again. The nurses gave me a foam chair that pulled out flat on the floor so I might sleep next to him. He needed help to turn in the bed. He needed help to have a drink. Good Friday was another long day of pain. At about 5 o'clock on Holy Saturday morning, Brian began to bleed. He and I struggled together to reach the bathroom. He sat on the chair in the shower to try to clean himself up. I called Claire, the nurse on duty. I could tell that Brian was going to pass out from bleeding. I threw a towel over him to protect his modesty, and Claire and I both lifted him back to his bed. Oh God! The electric blood pressure monitor just made that awful bleeping sound that everyone knows from television programs like ER, when some poor misfortune's heart has stopped. Bleep. Was that it? I felt panic rising inside me. I didn't wish Brian to suffer any more, but I wasn't ready. Not yet, not now, not this minute. I soothed him. "Brian, it's okay. You're okay, love. Mum is with you. I'll look after you as I always have." I prayed silently for a little more time. "Please, one more day. I'll be grateful for just one more day," I implored. I injected all the confidence I could muster into speaking with Brian, wanting him to feel safe, not to be frightened. But silently I said to myself, "Brian, if you need energy to hang on, you can use mine. I can hold the two of us until you get blood." Who knows whether that kind of thought makes any sense, or indeed any difference. I'm just telling you my natural reaction was to try to reach out and save Brian. Just then Claire said, "I have a pulse. Send for the doctor." Claire was Brian's favourite nurse. She always made him feel at ease. Blood and platelets were ordered. Platelets are the clotting agents that prevent bleeding out. The phlebotomist came to take a sample of Brian's blood to send to the blood transfusion service for a cross-match. I felt like screaming something when she drained those last few precious drops from his unconscious body. "You'll kill him," I wanted to scream. "Don't take those last few precious drops of blood from him." "Should I send for his father?" I asked, hoping for a reassuring answer. Of course, deep down I knew she had to say yes. "And you might like to send for a priest," she added. My heart sank. Claire began to wash the blood from the bathroom walls to lessen the horror for the visitors. When his dad saw Brian, he was so shocked at the terrible sight before him. Brian lay still, silent and unconscious in the bed. He was lifeless and as white as his sheet. We just stayed close to him. Could we collect the units of blood from wherever they were stored? Could we speed it up in any way? No. It took 2 hours for the platelets to arrive. Can you imagine how many seconds are in 2 hours? At 6 a.m. on Holy Saturday morning, when you know your child could die at any second, can you visualize the torture of waiting that long? The platelets eventually arrived. The priest came, a total stranger. I was hoping he wouldn't be all dressed up in black with a white collar. I fretted that in his weakened condition, if Brian opened his eyes and found a clergyman praying over him, he might get a fright that could surely finish him. Unfortunately, the traditionally dressed priest looked every inch a clergyman. "Can you bless him through the glass door?" I asked. "I couldn't anoint him without putting the oils on him," he replied. "Well, then you can take your God off with you. Your God is of no use to this young man," I told him. So I let the priest go. I'm sure he just thought I was suffering from stress. But that was not the reason. I'm a very practical person. I didn't want to run the risk of my child waking up and finding a priest anointing him. I didn't want him to be scared. I certainly would get a fright if I woke up and found a priest standing over me praying. Intention is everything, I believe. God did not let us down. Our local priest heard that a boy from the parish was in hospital and called to see him. Father Nyan, a shy, saintly man, arrived in the afternoon and blessed our Brian. How can I describe what it's like to listen to the priest anoint my unconscious child? A part of me was praying with all my heart, and a part of me was silently screaming, "This can't be happening. This is a nightmare. I can't be standing here like it's a normal thing to do, witnessing the anointing of this most precious gift of my life. I don't want to do this thing. I don't want to be here." Vicky and the boys called later in the morning. They were so shocked. We waited until they had woken up to tell them what had happened. Mainly we did this as we didn't want Brian to become alarmed if he woke up and saw everyone around his bed at some ungodly hour on a Saturday morning. Also, I wanted to be kind to my children and shield them from anything I could. We're a family that just doesn't do drama. We go quiet. We all talk across each other with great enthusiasm on a good day. On a difficult day, we say little and really listen to each other. It was now evident to our children that Brian was seriously ill. John had plans to study over Easter and he hoped to get an honours degree. But of course, his concentration had now gone out the window. It was April 14th, Paul's 20th birthday. This was not how we envisaged spending it. We all just sat by the bedside. We didn't really say anything to each other. We didn't want to acknowledge what had happened and exactly where we stood. We were talking about the smaller things, like how long it takes to get the platelets and how quickly they might work. When I reflect on it, we're all on the same page when it comes to bigger events. We ask how we can be of help, and then we do what we need to do quietly and with minimum fuss. A lovely young lady from the Leukemia Association called by with an Easter egg and PlayStation game for Brian. She'd called in a couple of days earlier, telling us that her association visits hospitals at Christmas and Easter to give gifts to leukemia patients. When she heard about the new PlayStation, she offered to bring him a game. I looked so wistfully at that chocolate egg, wishing Brian would live to taste a mouthful. In order to respect the privacy of patients, nursing staff don't update every member of cleaning and catering staff on current patient status. Of course, this is correct procedure. But it seemed to underline our pain when someone breezed in and said, "Will I leave a cup of coffee and a biscuit? He might like it when he wakes up." "No, we're okay, thanks," I answered. It was on the tip of my tongue to explain that I didn't even know if he would wake up. Late in the evening, Brian opened his eyes and we were all relieved. We carried on as if nothing had happened and he just slept late. He never asked, and I never mentioned anything about bleeding out in the shower. I suppose he must have said to himself that he didn't even remember getting back into bed after the shower. How often have we said that when we arrived somewhere? Said to ourselves that we didn't remember the details of the journey as we were preoccupied. It was a weekend, so it made sense that we would all be at his bedside. Dr. Murphy and Dr. Cotter led the medical team who took care of Brian on the ward. Dr. Murphy also volunteered as a trainer for the local street league football team. As well as looking after Brian medically, he stopped by daily to chat for ages about the various players, matches and events on the sports field. I would wait outside the door during the consultation. I was scared and I kept wishing he would hurry up and go. You see, I told Dr. Murphy that I didn't want Brian to know he was dying. However, as he was an adult, he had the right to know, and Dr. Murphy said he would tell him the truth if asked. I thought Brian would be too shy to ask the medical team such a question. But I was afraid that someday, when he felt particularly low, he might bring up the prospect of dying during one of his many long conversations with Dr. Murphy. Knowing Brian, it would probably come in the form of a joke. But while all Dr. Murphy's kindness was wasted on me, his conversations meant the world to Brian, as was the intention. Often, when I would walk around in the isolation ward, Brian, who could not move without help, would say, "Mom, I can't see your face." That was about the only useful thing I could do, just to be there, to help him feel safe. Otherwise, I spent my time moving pillows when he continuously turned and twisted, trying to find a less painful position, and airing him. It helped to waft the sheet and allow him feel a breeze on his aching body. I massaged him and smoothed some cream in his face. I took his hands and held them to my face. "I love you, baby," I said. "I love you too, Mum." "Thank you for being my baby," I said to him. "Thank you for being my mum." He just didn't know how hard it was for me. I seldom cried when I was with him, but when I couldn't stop a tear, I would tell him why. "You know how much it hurts me to see you in pain, my precious." And he seemed to believe that. He didn't know how much my heart was breaking. His feet looked so perfect. Like every other parent, we had spent a fortune on correctly fitting shoes when Brian was small. He played soccer and football and was a good runner. He was left-footed and was forever kicking a ball. But now his feet gave him so much trouble. Even when the door to his room was opened, the movement of air gave him intense pain, especially in his feet. He spent long days and nights in that one room, in isolation. Initially, all visitors wore sterile clothing to prevent the spread of germs to Brian. He hated all this fuss, especially for his friends. He was embarrassed. I explained to him that it was the visitors who might pass germs on to him. But he felt like he was the one with the awful disease that he might pass on to us. When it was evident that Brian would die anyway, it was no longer necessary to follow the regime that might, in better circumstances, have saved his life. I remember looking out from the second-floor window of our hospital room at the little patch of blue sky we could see from his bed. It was a beautiful day. There wasn't a cloud to be seen. Brian was lying on his bed, with only a sheet over his aching, disabled body. "We could be on holidays in Spain," he said. "You know, the blue sky, no clouds or anything, and sleeping with only a sheet on." "Indeed we might," I answered. But I struggled to say the words, knowing I would never sit in the sun with him again. I felt that, without my Brian, I was never, ever going to know happiness again for as long as I lived. There was a number of different issues for Brian. One was around bleeding. When his platelets were low, he was at huge risk of hemorrhage. In fact, that's what we were waiting for, the final hemorrhage. I hoped it would be a brain hemorrhage, as Brian would feel nothing. But it could be a bleed. He could just bleed to death in front of me. and there was nothing I could do, nothing the hospital could do. I tried desperately to think of what might help, so I asked my friend Anne to buy me some black towels, so it would be less traumatic for Brian to watch himself bleed to death. 10 minutes should do it, I was told, and he would probably lose consciousness during that time. How would I manage to help him through that? Would his life flash before him, and would he be suddenly scared and realise he was dying? Could I depend on myself to help him to leave us easily when it was his time? Brian was becoming anemic, and blood was constantly being sent for. God bless those people who donate blood. I wish they could see what good they do. When his platelet count was really low, I was terrified. I learned that the staff did not order platelets until things were quite drastic, as they could lose their effect at some point. They had to gauge and balance all the risks. When platelets were low, it was easy to see the effect on his body. His gums bled and he had black and blue bruise spots all over his body. I knew then that his chances of hemorrhage were particularly high. A low blood count from losing all the blood made him exhausted, though this seemed the least of our problems at the time. There was also the issue of pain. Brian had bone pain. His body visibly trembled, and this was accompanied by deep and merciless panting. Oh, could I bear another minute helplessly watching him try to muster enough energy to stay on top of it and cope with this relentless suffering? I had discovered that when Brian couldn't breathe with the pain, what was actually happening was a progression of the leukemia. He wasn't getting enough oxygen, hence the panting. There was nerve damage to his mouth from early on. He had no feeling at all in his lower jaw and lip. He had to devise a way of eating so as not to bite his tongue. It was like eating straight after going to the dentist while still numb, but this was permanent. There was nerve damage to his feet, which caused intense pain. In hospital, the phlebotomist took a blood sample every day, and this was checked to keep track of his blood count. Dr. O'Brien from Marymount Hospice called to visit him every day to monitor the pain, and would adjust the prescription to increase the dosage of pain relief drugs or prescribe additional as required. But the pain relief took time to work. Despite all good intentions, there was lots of pain. After some time, anaesthetic tablets were prescribed and they controlled the nerve pain to Brian's feet. He had nerve damage to his arms and lost power in them. My Brian was always so good with his hands. He was the one who loved to cut the grass and do other jobs around the house. He was so meticulous and tidy. If my clothesline was at an angle, or a bedhead was loose, Brian came to the rescue with his screwdriver. All I could do was love him. I love my precious Boober, I said. I called him Boober when he was little, because I thought he looked like one of those little Fraggles that he used to watch in Fraggle Rock on TV. I sat with him in that hospital room, watching Star Trek, Judge Judy and soaps on TV. I slept on the pull-out chair on the floor at night. My mind was racing. I must be calm when he is dying, I told myself. I mustn't cry and make it harder for him to go. I've heard people can hear for 20 minutes after breathing has stopped, so I had to devise a plan, a what-to-do plan, as Brian used to say. So the best I could come up with was to say to him what I said to him any time he went out the door to school or elsewhere. God bless, protect, guard and guide my precious boy. That way he might, I imagined, feel like I was giving him permission to go on his journey. My mother had similarly blessed me on my journeys. But what about this guard and guide bit? What was out there? Sometimes you hear that this particular journey is not always simple. He had no dead loved ones that he knew who could come to meet him. You often hear that someone you love comes to welcome you. So what to do? I decided I would give Michael the Archangel the job. I've often asked Michael to protect me in the red and gold cloak in which I have seen him depicted in medieval pictures. Michael, I pleaded, I give you my most precious possession. I ask you to put your arm around my baby and bring him safely wherever it is that he's going. I ask you to use your sword of truth to cut through anything in the way. Don't leave him go until he is safely home. And that was all I could do. I had to trust someone if I couldn't do it myself. So I trusted Archangel Michael, and I would say, God bless, protect, etc., and that was it. There was so much more I wanted to say, but I couldn't. I mustn't. I expect you will have this surreal experience of planning a death for a loved one at some point. It's the price one pays for living and loving. The ones you love may travel over before you, and you will want to savour every precious moment of their lives. My dad, whom I adored, died suddenly when I was 17 years old. I didn't get to say goodbye. Being with Brian during his terminal illness was my first experience of this. Day by day, we struggled with the platelet count, the anemia, the searing pain. Each jostled for position to be the most critical factor torturing my child. Every day he had blood tests. To get the results back as quickly as possible to the ward, I brought the sample down to the haematology department and the staff handed me the results in a few minutes. Will the blood transfusions have helped? I wondered anxiously. Or will the chemo have knocked back those immature white cells? I tried to have an everyday chat with whoever else was sitting waiting for blood results outside the haematology department door with me. I understood basic information about the results. Ideally, the percentage of leukemia cells should be low. I worried about Brian's platelet count, which should have been 140 to 400. Dr. Murphy had told me that Brian would likely bleed when the platelet count was in the teens, meaning that could happen when his platelet count would be 14 or 15, for example. One particular day I was chatting about the beautiful weather we were having with a lady outside haematology. When I glanced down at the results I was handed. Jesus, 3. Brian's platelet count was 3. Oh no, I thought. He's died on his own upstairs while I'm chatting here. Oh, please no, please no, please not alone, please. Don't let him die alone. Panic set in. Was this it? Was it over? Was the waiting over? Was it happening now? I sprinted down the corridor, up the main hall, all the time feeling that I had failed him, that he had faced his death alone. I took the stairs 3 at a time. Excuse me, I called, as I frantically pushed past people. I ran into the ward and burst into Brian's room, afraid of what I'd see. Brian smiled at me like all was well in the world. Hi, love, I called as casually as I could. Forgot to drop your results to the nurse's station, back in a jiffy. I rushed to the nurse's station, tightly clasping my Brian's death sentence. Platelets were ordered immediately and we were in with a chance. Would he last the 2 hours that it took to treat the blood and transport it? I chatted idly to Brian about this and that, and there was so much more I wanted to say. I could not say aloud what was in my breaking heart. I couldn't tell him that I loved him and I was frightened of all that was ahead of us. I couldn't even whisper that life was testing me to the last. Everything was wrong. Everything was so very wrong. 2 hours later the platelets arrived, and my overwhelming panic was relieved, to be replaced by the now customary fear and dread. Days later Brian got a throat infection. There was panic, as staff could not bring down his temperature. He couldn't swallow, he couldn't speak. The pain. The hospice staff called every day. He had intravenous antibiotics in one arm and blood and chemo as well, with fluids of course on another drip to keep him hydrated. The nutritionist called to see if she could manage to get any calorie-loaded drinks into him, to prevent him losing more weight. But he couldn't swallow, even a sip. He hated looking so thin. I was frightened going to sleep on my foam bed on the floor in case something happened and he wasn't able to call me. I propped my mobile phone in his hands with my name on it. He'd only have to hit the button to ring my phone and wake me. Would he be able to do that? Hit the button on the phone if he took a turn? I had no idea, but I couldn't think of any better plan. The 3rd antibiotic treatment worked for Brian, and his temperature came down, and he was able to speak to us again. Mummy, when I look in the mirror it doesn't even look like me, he said, of his gaunt appearance. His Uncle Julian called to see him, and even though he had visited him since he got sick, he was so shocked by Brian's deterioration that he had to stop the car on his way home because he thought he was going to throw up. He needed to walk around and recover. As a family, we all put on the performance of our lives. We were happy and cheerful with Brian, chatting idly about who might be chosen for the next Celtic line-out, how exciting a television show was, or some such nonsense. We could not for a moment allow our faces to show Brian the pain we were in. How often did life seem like some kind of a dream, living one reality and feeling quite another? I kept asking myself, how was I supposed to do this? How does one care for a dying child? Keeping a smile on my face seemed the right thing to do. Yet if I tell you I was smiling while minding my child, it seems gross. It was one of the many contradictions that had turned everything upside down and inside out, in this new life which was full of pain, confusion and terror. I was constantly fearful of what was coming down the tracks, going over and over in my mind, how I might master the various challenges. Brian's arms were quite disabled. He could use his fingers, but he had no power in his hands. He couldn't even open a Coke bottle. He could only twist the top if I had opened it. I had a really strong urge to put a pillow over his face and finish him off myself. I wanted the suffering to end. I know I could never have done such a thing, but I wanted to. Life can be so difficult and confusing. I wanted to do the wrong thing for the right reason. Or was it the right thing for the wrong reason? Was it the right thing to take him out of his misery? Was it wrong to want him alive? I really could not be clear in my head as to what was right and what was wrong. Life is like that, isn't it? Sometimes it asks us to make impossible decisions with no experience or training to guide us.